Well, good afternoon, or I should say good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko, and I have the very good fortune of directing the Environmental Change and Security Program. And on behalf of our president and director, former Congressman Lee Hamilton, it's a terrific pleasure to welcome you all to the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and to welcome you to a session that has been entitled From Conflict to Peacebuilding, the Role of Natural Resources and the Environment, which just so happens to be the title of a new report from the UN Environment Program and their Conflicts and Disasters Program, a program that we here at the Wilson Center have been very fortunate to have worked with for a number of years now, a very dynamic program that you will hear about from some of the folks working on that directly, but also as really a great privilege that we've had now for the third time to have Achim Steiner, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, here in town joining us. And as you will hear, and those of you who've heard him before, in his very eloquent fashion, can talk about these issues and set them in the context of the UNEP agenda, which, as we all know, is a very big agenda, a very challenging agenda, but one that more and more so includes these issues. And so it's terrific to have Achim here. Dan Riefsnyder, it's tremendous to have him back as well from the State Department. As many of you know, has really been leading the charge here and in fact, wasting no time under the new administration, making some terrific headlines at the Governing Council meeting and really showing U.S. leadership there in terms of some of the announcements on Mercury and such. So Dan, it's a pleasure to have you back here joining us again here at the Wilson Center, and it's terrific to have the State Department and OES so intimately involved with these issues as well. Andrew Morton, who, as I mentioned, is based in Geneva at UNEP's Post-Conflict and Disaster Management Branch, or the Conflicts and Disasters Program. Andrew, as you will hear, is somebody who has spent a great deal of time in the field as a program manager, was really the lead on what was, I think, a tremendous contribution done for their Sudan report, and is now working in a year into the Democratic Republic of the Congo program, and just coming fresh from a Haiti tour where they're setting up a program there as well. Let me say just a word. We're sitting here at the Wilson Center, which, as I think many of you know, is the nonpartisan, non-advocacy formal memorial to Wilson, where these worlds of scholarship and policy can come together and debate and discuss these issues. Our environmental change and security programs have in our 15th year, looking at these issues, really trying to understand how environment, population, development, health issues are part of a conflict, foreign policy, security policy context. So it's terrific to look out and see people from all of those communities here. And that's really the point, to have the opportunity for us to engage in this community dialogue. We are webcasting tonight's event live, and really all that means for you folks here in the room is when it comes to Q&A, I ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to come to you with a microphone, so not only we can hear you, but folks online can hear you. Those of you who are watching online, you can see the PowerPoint slides by clicking just right on the side of the screen and follow along during Andrew's presentation, so you can see the graphics as well. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Achim Steiner to kick us off. And again, it's a great pleasure. As you know, he's the Executive Director of UNEP. Previous to that, IUCN, one of the other ones that may not know as much about, but really instrumental in the World Commission on Dams. I think tremendous contributions made there. So it's terrific to welcome Achim back to the center. Please. Sir.
Thank you, Jeff. And always very nice to listen to your introduction. Good evening, everybody, and good evening, world out there. If you are on the internet, it's once again a great pleasure to be here with Dan and also with my colleagues from our post-conflict and disaster branch, who, as you will see with Andrew just now, have been working on these issues in a broader community for quite a while. But why we were keen to present this report to you here is, and it is something that I don't say because UNEP obviously was a key player in the production of this report. I find the summary that this report has put together on both the key issues, some of the historical trends and patterns that we have observed, and the agenda on what we need to work on, one of the more succinct and actionable pieces of analysis but also policy relevant material that I've read for a while. And we in fact just had a workshop in Nairobi just a couple of weeks ago on environment and conflict and also the issue of peacekeeping. Two reasons why I was also very keen to be here with you tonight. One is, I think, related to the fact that this sort of work signals what the United Nations Environment Programme in at least one respect is all about. We are first and foremost the Environment Programme of the United Nations. Our role is to try within the UN family to look at issues of environment, natural resources, sustainability, and think about ways in which, under the mandates of the very wide range of institutions in the UN and the multilateral system, these issues can become part of their regular work. And it is particularly gratifying to have seen the cooperation between UNEP on the one hand and a circle of experts that extends into, you had mentioned IUCN just now, this report was in part workshopped at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, in the context of NATO, in cooperation with the Peacebuilding Commission in the United Nations, with a number of experts from around the world. We have seen, I think, here an example of what it is to bring the scientific and also empirical evidence on environment, conflict and peacekeeping essentially into the domain of the peacekeeping world, which needs to think about these issues from a number of angles that perhaps are different from the past. The second reason why I'm very keen to move this report into, let's say, more of a focused debate is that it is part of what UNEP at the moment is trying to help shape in terms of a discourse. The environmental agenda for a very long time has in essence been problem focused. Our role has been to identify problems, to show where the blind spots of societies and economic policies are, to uncover environmental destruction and degradation, to be, if you want, a wake-up call to the international community on what is going wrong in the environment. And that work, I think, will never cease, and it is a critical part of empowering, first of all, public debate, and secondly, also policy action and responses in our societies. But I think for perhaps too long, partly out of our own making, but also because it suits the image of the environmental agenda, we are always associated with problems, constraints, scenarios of doomsday, rather than actually being solution providers, opportunity creators, problem solvers in that sense. And you may be aware that in the last few weeks, UNEP has been putting a lot of work into trying to shape a discourse and a debate in our nations, in our communities on the financial crisis and the environmental agenda. It's something that here in Washington and with the new administration is not exactly unusual because you are in the midst of that very debate. But we have taken this idea of the financial crisis, the economic crisis, and the environmental imperatives to act very much into a global context, have shaped the debate around this notion of a global Green New Deal, and in that sense providing, in a moment of disruption, frustration, destabilization and economic problems, a perspective that in fact if you take the environmental agenda and you link economy and environment, you become also a part of the solution. In fact, you become a critical part, we believe, of dealing with the economic recession from a different and transformative point of view. And in addressing the issue of environment, natural resources, conflict, peacekeeping, I think we actually can provide a critical set of building blocks that would allow us to be not just lamenters on the sidelines, as we often have been over the last couple of decades, as we have watched civil strife, civil wars, wars between countries result in massive human suffering, human misery, but also massive environmental degradation, destruction, and essentially foreclosing opportunities for communities to recover from conflict because the very resource base they need to draw on has either been severely impacted or even destroyed. What the report seeks to do is, in a sense, provide both a historical perspective from the viewpoint of what kind of trends and patterns can we discern from what we have observed when environmental issues, natural resource issues have found themselves at the center of conflicts or wars or civil strife. And what the report does lay out is, if you want, almost a framework for understanding what is often a very diverse set of circumstances. No war, no conflict, no resource constellation is ever the same. But there are, I think, in the report some very interesting patterns that are put before us to think about, can we get beyond the point where environment and conflict always has to be a story of tragedy with no happy ending? The three pathways that the report does look at is from the point of view of how do environment and natural resource issues, one, contribute and drive conflict, because increasingly in our world that is going to be an issue that we are confronted with. It is not just a phenomenon of destruction as a impact, as a almost side event to a core conflict. In fact, natural resource issues, environmental change and the consequences it is imposing on local communities, nation states, transboundary issues is increasingly going to be a contributing factor and a driver. Secondly, as we have seen more and more in recent decades, natural resources become also a financing vehicle for conflict, sustaining conflict well beyond the point of where conflict had its origin, to actually having become part of a war economy, a conflict economy, and therefore extending conflicts well beyond the point where they perhaps traditionally would have ceased, either because people, would have made the point they were trying to make, or they would have gained control over a resource. And what we see in DRC, what we saw for a long time in Angola and many other parts of the world, is that natural resources and environmental assets become part of continuing to sustain conflicts. A third pathway that the report identifies, and I think it's one that we have paid far too little attention to, is that very often these issues can also undermine peacekeeping efforts. And in fact, where a political agreement may be reached, the temptation, partly because some people will lose control over resources, or they may want to revert after the signing of a peace agreement to a situation during the conflict, that in a number of cases, and the report lays this out very clearly, a so-called relapse phenomenon has become quite common. And if we do not understand how environment and natural resources can undermine very volatile peace agreements and, let's say, conflict resolution strategies, we actually risk within a year or two or three very often to find ourselves back where we started off from. The other part of the analytical framework that the report provides is looking a little bit also at the impacts, the nature of the impacts. There are direct impacts, indirect impacts, and institutional impacts that the report describes and also provides, if you want, as a framework for trying to understand how we would be able to either avoid, minimize, or even prevent some of these impacts from occurring. And I won't go into detail because Andrea, in fact, will provide some very live examples of that in a minute. If we look at the issue of conflict and environment, both from a historical perspective and a scenario perspective, then clearly what the report does show us is that we have a growing number of conflicts over time, and certainly a significant number that this report has captured, where the linkage between the two, natural resources and, let's say, growing tensions between communities or countries, has become a phenomenon that we have to understand not as something that is singular, but in fact there is a pattern. There is a trend, and that trend, if anything, is worrying, because it is not one that is declining, it is increasing. Secondly, that leads us also to, and this is not so much in the report, but where we in UNEP are working increasingly on the question of what scenarios do we discern from a perspective in the future. One indicator of how seriously member states now take these issues is that we have in our new medium-term strategy 6 major areas in which UNEP is meant to provide key services to the member states, to the international community. And for the first time, conflicts and disasters have become one of the 6 areas. And this is as surprising to me as it was, I think, to many, because less than, 8, 9 years ago, UNEP did not even work on these issues. It worked on them in terms of assessment. It maybe had interventions in selective places, but it was only under the previous executive director that a conflicts and disasters unit and then our collaboration with other parts of the UN system began to emerge, and literally within 6 years the international community has elevated these issues to one of the 6 major areas in which this institution is meant to work. I think that provides you with one indicator of this. The second indicator, I think, is simply one where we need to look at the plethora of reports that are out there now. Whether it is in terms of increasing populations, whether it is in terms of resource scarcity scenarios. We've just had the World Water Forum happening in Istanbul. We can look at soils, we can look at biodiversity, we can look at fisheries, we can look at timber, we can look at virtually any kind of resource that is at the moment subject to extractive mining practices rather than sustainable harvesting and sustainable use. Add to that also resource economics, that with scarcity comes a kind of rent-seeking behavior of those who have access and control over resources, and overlay all of that with climate change, global warming, and the disruptive nature of the impacts that we are now beginning to see, not only in terms of scenarios, but unfolding on a scale and on a pace that is putting us already at the top end of the IPCC scenarios. And it does not take a lot of imagination to see why, looking at environment, natural resources, and the potential for societies under stress to essentially escalate into conflict and competition is not just some doomsday scenario. It is a very real prospect, which is not, and I emphasize this, declaring the world on an inevitable path to a third world war over water. I think what we are faced with is the challenge of being able to organize ourselves as societies and as an international community to avoid being led down that path by events and by circumstance. And that's where the 6 points that the report lays out, and I'll leave it to Andrew in a moment to spell them out, but it ranges from early warning and early action to issues of oversight and protection of resources during conflict. Remember the financing of conflict issues. Addressing natural resources and environment as part of peacemaking and peacekeeping. And I think this is a critical message. We underestimate the extent to which these issues can in fact become a part of peace building and peacemaking, and include them therefore also in the peace building strategies that we apply. And this is not just the UN and its peacekeeping operations, it is the way that we engage conflicting parties and look at the opportunities for developing shared agendas and common interests in a peace building phase. Harness natural resources for economic recovery. In Africa, very often the ability to demobilize troops, to redeploy them into investing in the re-establishment and restoration of natural resources, afforestation, ecosystem restoration, has often been underestimated, and I think one of the missed opportunities of getting through that very critical phase of what you do with people who have known nothing but war and are now expected to become civilians overnight when most of the country cannot provide even the basic infrastructure or support services. And capitalize on the potential for environmental cooperation to contribute to peace building. Particularly in transboundary context, I think we have a lot to learn here. Let me end by just saying that we take this report not only extremely seriously, but in fact as a basis upon which UNEP can engage with a whole series of actors, reaching into the military establishments, reaching into political arenas that previously perhaps viewed these issues as extraneous to the kind of expertise and empirical evidence that we can provide. And I'm delighted to say, after my meetings yesterday in New York with Alain Lerat, the Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping, we are now proposing to bring that expertise right into the peacekeeping operation itself, by looking at the opportunity of starting with 3 to 4 countries where we will put green advisors, so to speak, with the blue helmets, making, in a sense, the peacekeeping operation in itself more environmentally sensitive, just from a direct impact point of view, providing the kind of expertise that will allow a peacekeeping operation to inform not only its own footprint, but in fact the opportunities for peace building through looking at opportunities from an environmental, natural resource restoration point of view, and thirdly, to draw on the real expertise that peacekeeping provides us in understanding how do you minimize the potential for conflicts to escalate again and to revert into a conflict situation. So these are just a few examples of how we are working on this. And from Andrew, you will also hear that in UNEP itself, over the years, we have developed a whole body of empirical evidence and expertise and knowledge by having worked from Kosovo to Afghanistan to Iraq, now DRC, the Gaza and West Bank situations as well, an increasingly complex set of experiences that have led us to bring this kind of work in partnership with a number of other actors right to the international policy arena, where I think it is now ripe for some significant reflection and action. Thank you very much.
Andrew, why don't you go right ahead and get the slides? Thank you very much, Achim. That very end there, the green advisors with the blue helmets, that has been tried to achieve that before, and people have failed. So that really is a tremendous success that you've convinced that side of the house at the UN that this is something they should really integrate and mainstream. So that's big news. I appreciate you sharing that with us. That's real progress. So Andrew, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Akim, for covering actually all the complexities of the subject before I had to try. So what I will try and do now is we'll quickly go through the frameworks and the theories, but spend most of the time just looking at a snapshot of what this means in practice in case studies at various countries. And then we'll go a little bit more into some of the recommendations, key findings. So the background. Essentially the branch, the unit, has been working for over 10 years. We've had about 20 major operations. We have half a dozen running on large scale at the moment. And total expenditure is in the order of about 100 million if you look at both conflicts and disasters. So it's an evolving program. And after 10 years, it was time to sit down and reflect, actually pull together the lessons learned and start to think about, rather than just activity, how we're going to put together a strategy and plan our interventions as much as you can in a conflict unit for the next decade or more. We also have increasing demand for our services, so we need to prioritise. We have the new change in organisation in UNEP, which is extremely welcome. And we have links with the larger UN community, such as the Peace Building Commission. And the giant on the block now is climate change and security debate, which is really starting to gain momentum. So here's some key questions which are already being addressed. I'll flick through. How many internal conflicts are actually linked? What are the numbers? What are the main linkages? Again, covered. And what can be done? So let's have a look at the resources. In simple terms, high-value, portable resources, the conflict resource. The second type, the scarce resources. They result in very different conflict dynamics. Each country has its own collection or mixture of these types of resources. What was the process? As already covered, essentially we're looking at partnerships with a range of experts, various elements of the UN, extensive work on looking at case studies, both from our team and around the world, extensive consultation on the material, and finally a sign-off by someone who's now quite senior in your government. So essentially, I think a fairly robust process. Here's our key experts, including our friend Jeff there. Thanks, Jeff, for your contributions. And we'll hit some key findings. First of all, the number, the linkages, 40% of the interstate, in other words, the civil wars, the instability, have a strong link to natural resources. These conflicts that do have the linkage, they're twice as likely to relapse. So you can see why, and that is because a political resolution will not solve the underlying problem. And finally, why we see there's a need for action is that less than a quarter of the peace agreements in such conflicts actually have any reference to natural resources whatsoever. So there's a gap that needs to be addressed. So here's some of the numbers, and so who's who of conflicts over the last 19 years. All of the ones you think of, and if you look at the list of resources, it's quite diverse. Everything through to fungus, which is sold as a Chinese medicine in Nepal, through to copper, gold, opium. The list is quite extensive. It's not the classic of timber and diamonds. It's much broader than that. Okay, let's look at the intellectual framework, so to speak. The simplest one is the impacts. Direct impacts are actually quite measurable. They're the things we see on the television. The more insidious are actually indirect. And the thing that is never really understood is the importance of governance failure in these. Next result, we have undermining of peace. Second, as discussed, as a driver of conflict. It's one of the reasons it finances it, and there's vested interests that like the conflict to continue because that's a business environment where they're competitive. And then we turn around and try and look at positive angles. There are opportunities for peace where mixed political and natural resource conflicts, you can use the natural resource angle to forge peace and forge recovery. So we're looking at it from a positive angle. And we're pushing now, as we're hearing by this excellent news, to try and put this framework into place. So this is moving very fast now. So I'll move on to some case studies, just picking out some of the operations we've been to. I will not go into the detail in each country, but just give you a snapshot of some of the key items and nuances. Direct impacts, Lebanon, it's straightforward. Large-scale military action has some fairly straightforward impacts on the environment, on infrastructure, waste management, land use denial, etc. Chemical release when you target chemical facilities. Again, fairly predictable, but things that need to be understood. The role of UNEP in this case was really to be a expert witness, a neutral expert witness. Obviously, in a conflict, both sides give out different news. Our role is to state the facts. The indirect impacts actually are bigger. They're the more insidious ones because in a conflict, normal life stops, including livelihoods, and people move to coping strategies. And here's a quick one, for example, Afghanistan. Deforestation rocketed since Soviet occupation and then the civil wars that followed. In some areas, 95% deforestation. And this essentially was a livelihood. To talk about pistachio forests, they were a stable livelihood. And now, if we talk about Afghanistan, what is the growing crop in Afghanistan at the moment? It's opium, which is the finance source for the Taliban. Another indirect impact, these conflicts generate humanitarian disasters. Very difficult to control and address basic humanitarian needs, and one of those is energy. So when you have 250,000 people displaced, and they need food, which we supply, they need energy, they're next to a national park, and they take the timber. So this is a big problem, particularly in Darfur where we're working. Darfur in particular is an extreme case of an aid economy. Some towns in northern Darfur, the rent for property has gone up by 10 times. And the people renting them are employed by the peacekeepers. These new towns and villas, they're built of bricks, and those bricks are made with trees which are cut down by the displaced people and sold to the brick kiln operators. You're generating deforestation through your operations. So it'd be good to stop that, or at least turn that into something sustainable. Institutional impacts, Iraq, many years of sanctions and then 2 wars essentially left a country which was quite industrialised, incapable of managing its industrial operations. So we saw a lot of very problematic contaminated sites in Iraq. Gaza, a lot of things are broken down in Gaza, and one of them is environmental infrastructure. So here we see a simple case of sewage. It's a very congested urban environment, and they have giant problems simply due to lack of governance, decay. They cannot afford to run these things, so we have problems like you see here. Another institutional impact is essentially criminalisation of the authorities, and this is occurring in some states. We see it in Congo, and to be honest, quite understandable when you have things like civil servants not receiving salaries for 4 months, people giving a mandate to monitor natural resources and no funds. So we have charcoal trade in Congo, which essentially is a business. It's a legal business, but it's a business, and you can see why, because there are not many other livelihood options around. So let's look at some other examples. Darfur, a place we talk almost too much about. It's a very complex conflict. One layer of the conflict is about ownership of land and water. And I won't go into the details, but there is, for example, a tribal group known as the Abala. The rest of the world knows them as Janjaweed. They are cattle herding nomads. They have had deep environmental problems in their rangelands, falling rainfall, land degradation, blockage of stock routes, all sorts of problems. essentially look at destitution as a result of a range of pressures, and that makes them extremely vulnerable to recruitment for causes, good or bad. So a classic case of underlying factors causing vulnerability for conflict. This is a very straightforward case. War in Sierra Leone was bankrolled by resources. It also is bankrolling several militia groups in Congo for all sorts of diverse material, not just the minerals, but also bushmeat, charcoal, etc. And we have there some issues of vested interests. Where you have stable situation, legitimate business can establish itself and is competitive. Where there's instability, conflict risk, you get what I would call the sort of black side of the business community working. And for them, actually, they could be a spoiler. They don't want this thing to end because it's quite high profit margins, and it's a good opportunity for making a market, making a profit without much competition. Okay, so to turn positive, let's look at some opportunities and some examples. A very good example which exists is Rwanda. We have guerrilla tourism going on within a few kilometres of what essentially was a war zone, and the nations have cooperated to keep the tourism going. Rwanda generates a lot of income from this. Completely sustainable, well managed, and good cooperation between the conservation authorities. So excellent example, which we intend to expand on. Economic development, not yet a positive example for DR Congo, but essentially it's a resource-based conflict. All of the potential in Congo is about natural resource management. The recovery of Congo will be based on natural resources. So it is the pole we want to follow, how to sustainably manage the extraction, conversion and utilisation of the resources. Afghanistan, although we have major degradation, some projects show that you can instill natural resource management, sustainable development initiatives even in a war zone. So right in the middle of hotspots you can get things done, such as this solar project in the villages. And you have essentially not quite food for work, but livelihood initiatives such as these, which look at forestation as a peace dividend, but essentially an activity to generate livelihoods in the zone of conflict. Darfur, that's an opportunity at the moment. Now we understand the conflict better, now we understand the resource dynamics, etc. Any peace agreement, when the conditions are right, can start to write in the terms which deal with the equity issue and the land issue. So that's a potential. Haiti, it's not in conflict, it's got some stability problems. I was there last week. The big issue there is that environmental pressures and emergencies which are linked to climate change, such as increased hurricane frequency, they have the potential to make countries more and more difficult to govern. When you have large-scale displacement, annual emergencies, food insecurity, any government will be challenged, and fairly fragile governments such as you have in Haiti can be overwhelmed. So we see that one as a red flag in Haiti. We really need to work on that. Not to save the environment, but to keep the country together. Here's another positive one. We had a good dialogue going between Afghanistan and Iran for a while on a shared water basin, because as you know, river networks and lakes do not respect international boundaries. We even had a cooperation going between Iran and Iraq, who had an 8-year war in the area of their prior battle zone, talking about a shared resource, the marshes. So it is possible, and actually can be one of the few arenas where the two parties can meet. Okay, some good opportunities. We're looking forward. We're putting together a program now, is how to expand the cooperation between Congo, Uganda and Rwanda beyond guerrillas, and start talking about things such as charcoal trade, sustainable energy initiatives, fisheries, transboundary fishery agreements, all these sort of things which tie the nations together. So looking very good potential there. I'll just quickly go through. As described, the future trends are that demand for this and the needs will increase. Increasing population, consumption increasing as per rata capita goes up. As China gets richer, it needs more resources, etc. So we have the demand side increasing. Finite world, we have in degradation, we have the supply side decreasing. Governance remains a challenge in many countries, And we now have climate change as the new wild card, acting as a threat multiplier. It'll strike very unevenly, certain regions, certain countries. So the net forecast is the likelihood is going to increase. So we need to really pick up these opportunities. The recommendations. First thing is, if it's part of the conflict, we should actually analyse it and put it together as part of the brief. It's really a fairly easy win, actually, because all you need is analysis and asking the right questions. Peacekeeping, as we are looking at here, monitoring natural resources and actually looking at how to resolve things such as conflict financing are a real opportunity, in Congo in particular right now, but in many other cases. And peacemaking, it takes longer, but you need to put some sort of resource sharing or agreement into these peace deals. Political agreements based on figureheads or political parties are not enough. You need to look at, for example, these dispossessed tribes, these displaced populations, and say, how can we remove the conditions which made them vulnerable to instigation for conflict? How do we fix that? So to do that, you need to research and understand the situation before you bring in the diplomats. So we are really keen on this happening. In some cases, cooperation is not an option, and we're talking about punitive measures and things like sanctions. And they have worked. There's an example. It worked in Liberia. It can work in other things. We just need to do some homework on defining these resources and establish a process. We can continue on this environmental cooperation. It's, and again, another easy win, not in terms of quick fix, but there's numerous places where cooperation can start and put together a long-term solution for things like shared boundary resources, river networks, etc. For conflict prevention, for me, prevention is much more economic than attempted cure. It is peacekeeping operations, humanitarian responses, they can cost huge amounts of money. In Darfur, it's peacekeeping and the humanitarians at least $2 billion a year. Similar sums for Congo. Immense sums being spent essentially on trying to contain a situation. If you spend a fraction of that beforehand, you should be able to get some return. And here we talk about a bit of a sales pitch, I'm afraid. But basically, to get more intelligent about this, we need continuity, a critical mass. We need to actually start to provide this service to the world through things such as pooled service agreements, early warning analysis of various countries, which are not all about politics, but natural resource and climate change risks. These are sort of things that need continuity. A quick flick over there. We're doing a lot. We will do a lot more. And at that stage, I'll quickly come over our key messages. The numbers make sense. It counts. We need to look at this issue. We have the three linkages: impacts of conflict, drivers of conflict, and opportunities. We can and must integrate these into peace-building conflict prevention strategies. Demand will increase due to climate change, population growth, and some degradation. And now we are tooling up to meet the challenge, and we look forward to working with many of you in future and coming back perhaps a year from now and talking about what progress has been made in several countries. And I really look forward to working with DPKO in a range of countries with these blue helmets. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and I think we'll turn the floor over to Dan Riefsnyder for a few reflections before we open the floor for discussion.
Okay, this is working. Yeah, I'm not going to take a long time this evening, but I do appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight for the second time in about 6 months, being on this stage with Achim Steiner and his staff, and at the invitation of Jeff DeBelco to launch a UNEP study. The first one was, I think, last April, where we launched the Africa Atlas, and this is the peace-building, conflict and peace-building study tonight. We're very supportive, let me say, of what UNEP is doing in this area. I think it's excellent that it is one of the 6 thematic areas that have been agreed now as part of UNEP's work. I think UNEP is uniquely positioned to play a real catalytic role within the UN system, bringing together various parts of the UN system to kind of focus on the importance of natural resources and the importance of the environment in peace-building initiatives. I know there were 2 that I really wanted to cite. One is something that had happened. My staff had given me some points today because USAID has been doing a lot of work in this area. I need to make a mention of them, particularly with regard to a project in the Sudan. AID provided 1.8 million to UNEP for the Darfur Timber and Energy Project to plant 3 million seedlings for reforestation in IDP camps and surrounding areas that provide 300,000 fuel-efficient stoves to reduce demand for fuel wood and collaborate on natural resource management assessments and associated technical studies. This was a project that was started as a result of one of the resource assessments, the post-conflict assessments that UNEP had done. It grew out of that work that UNEP did. So we were working kind of hand in glove with UNEP in that effort. But also I had never been to the DR Congo until last year, and I made 3 different trips to the DR Congo last year. So we did some very interesting work in the eastern Congo, with Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, trying to look at the situation of the mountain gorillas that you saw in some of the pictures here tonight, and trying to figure out how we could try to work with those governments in those 3 countries to try to encourage the kind of activity that you saw on the Rwandan side of the border. You saw people paying $500 a permit to go view mountain gorillas. Rwanda and Uganda are making a fair amount of money off of this ecotourism now. And the same kinds of opportunities exist in the Congo, but for the problem that the militias at that time had taken over the Virungas National Park, a lot of the park areas, and tourists were prevented from going in there. And moreover, I think the guerrillas, Guerrillas, were actually cutting down trees to fuel this $20 million charcoal trade that Andrew mentioned. And we began to realize in the course of this work that if we were going to be concerned about the guerrillas, we had to be concerned first and foremost about the energy needs of the people in that area and trying to think about how to move them out of charcoal and into more modern sources of energy. And there are a number of possibilities in that part of the world, including low-head hydro and the possibilities of there's an enormous amount of methane at the bottom of Lake Kivu, for example, that people are now trying to recover, that could be bottled and used for cooking and this kind of thing. There are a number of different options. And in this effort, we've been working very closely with UNEP, with some of Andrew's staff, looking at the possibilities for how to supplement the efforts of the people in these areas who are working on this and try to figure out ways to overcome the conflicts that have plagued them for well over a decade, maybe for multiple decades, at the loss of maybe 5.5 million people. So this is quite important work. I think it was very exciting to be part of it. And I think, as Akam said, people often don't understand, sometimes the people that I work with, diplomats, don't understand how cooperating on a practical problem, a little thing like trying to safeguard mountain gorillas, sometimes war and peace is just too big to take on in one bite. You know, you kind of have to go at it in little bites, and you think, let's have a practical problem, let's have an issue where maybe we could see eye to eye and we could find a way, because if people are making this kind of money on ecotourism in Rwanda and Uganda, then maybe we could do it here in the Congo, and wouldn't that be swell? And, you know, you can move forward in these small ways. So I think it's very important to try to come at this, to try to have the environment and natural resource protection and conservation as part of these efforts. And I think UNEP is extremely well positioned to do it. I'm really glad to see that you have this wonderful publication. I hope everybody got a copy of it out there tonight. And we're very delighted to be here supporting this effort. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. We appreciate these. You're sharing your comments and your perspective and prioritizing and sharing your experience from the DRC. It's one that certainly has its more than its share of suffering and blessed with tremendous resources, but not always getting the headlines and the political attention. So we appreciate you keeping those kinds of issues up front and in front of the kind of the policy audience here in Washington and elsewhere. So let's turn to some questions. As I mentioned, because we're webcasting it, we want you to use a microphone. Let us know who you are, and you can pose it to the panel or pose it to one in particular. But we have a few minutes for discussion. So, Will, why don't we start right down here in the middle?
Hello, I'm Francine Madden with the Human Wildlife Conflict Collaboration. I want to thank all of you for your presentations. It's fabulous. I think you're going in the absolute right direction. I guess I would challenge you, because you don't have enough challenges as it is, to also look at this as when you look at sort of the environment and the natural resources as a neutral space for creating solutions, recognizing that those natural resources can sometimes be a cause of conflict, and by addressing some of the conflicts that go on with those natural resources, for instance, mountain gorillas, that you can sort of address peacekeeping in that way. And I bring this example up because I worked in Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in the mid to late 90s. And it could be argued that when the Interahamwe came in, and for those of you who are familiar with this case, where the Interahamwe came into Bwindi Impenetrable National Park and killed a number of people, the local people knew about this issue. They knew that the Interahamwe were coming in, and they were silenced. And because that relationship between the park and the local people had been eroded, because mountain gorillas were coming out of the park, raiding people's crops and attacking people, and that conflict that was going on was not being addressed, which is a conflict that goes on in Rwanda, Congo, and Uganda at present. Because that conflict was not being addressed, the local people kept silent, and the Ugandan army was not told what was going on, and therefore you had that kind of destruction. And so I think it is absolutely critical to recognize the value of the environment and natural resources, but also to recognize that to address, Andrew had a wonderful slide with land and minerals and that kind of thing, is looking at some of the causes of conflict. But I would include in that natural resources wildlife, and recognizing that can cause conflict, and that can be an incredible foundation for peacekeeping. And Daniel, what you said is looking at a practical local level, looking at human wildlife conflict and other kinds of wildlife conservation conflicts, and building on that. As a way to create peace in a broader community, I think can be a very powerful tool.
Do you want to respond to that or collect questions? How do we want to do this?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Well, yes, I agree. Simple enough. But the other thing for me is that in these places which are unstable, very impoverished, all assets, wildlife included, should earn their keep. And what we need to do is organise it so that wildlife does earn its keep through ecotourism, through all sorts of options, ecosystem services, catchment protection, so that the local people have a financial interest in protecting that wildlife. And that is working in many places. It's the basis of modern protected area management, is to get some sort of payback for the local population surrounding the park, and then they become its best defenders. So I agree, and things are moving in the right direction in some places. I don't doubt the loyalty of, for example, the Congolese and others towards their wildlife. In Garamba National Park recently, 8 people were killed, essentially defending park headquarters against rebel bases. So they are intensely proud of their wildlife, and they will do anything to keep it together. So there's good prospects in the future.
If I could just mention maybe another example from an earlier part of my life where I worked in fisheries, there was a very interesting example of this after the Falklands-Malvinas War, because the problem in that part of the world at the time, there's an enormous amount of short-finned squid around the Malvinas and the Falkland Islands, and what happened was that the Argentines and the UK were at loggerheads, and it meant that foreign fleets were coming in and essentially just ripping off all of these fishery resources, so that the two sides, even though they'd been at war with each other, they had a shared interest in trying to put some limits on the fishing that was taking place in this area, because it was a resource important to both sides. And we were able to kind of work with them at the time to try to, put in place some fisheries enforcement. But it was one of those things where war and peace was too big an issue, but fish, you could work with that, so, yeah.
Okay. Tampani, over here, and then we'll come over to John Pielemeyer and then go to the back. Leslie?
Yes, my name is Tapani Vaahtoranto. I'm at this institute and actually Jeff's program. Andrew Morton, you said that 40% of intrastate conflicts are linked to natural resources. I recently read a report on the implications of climate change for armed conflict written by Niels Petter Gleditsch from Norway and his colleagues. And in that report, they say that there is no statistical correlation between resource scarcity and armed conflict. Now, is there a contradiction between what you said and what Gleditsch is arguing?
Good question. I stand by the numbers which the team put together, because we did a lot of work on this.
In part with Niels Petter's work, but yeah.
So first thing is, if you can do very crude correlations, you won't find it, because there's always things like there's a political spark to it. But you have to look deeper and see, were there resources involved, what happened to them during that conflict? And you find a linkage in a lot more places than you think. It's not a straightforward case of resource scarcity started Darfur. In those things, it is rare. Normally it's the hidden problem, and it's a political spark or a tribal spark or economic spark that starts it off, and then that's called a political, tribal or ethnic conflict. But the foundation, one of the factors, is resources. So that's the sort of study we looked at. Where is this? Some of them are straightforward political, we agree. But I think 40% actually is pretty conservative.
I think, Tampani, it's in part how much or how little in terms of the connection to the conflict. And so Niels Petter Gleditsch's work that I think that you're citing is, for starters, it's kind of quantitative. So there are some limitations on what environmental variables can go into it, but it's focused on precipitation of the conflict. And I think here the definition is broader in terms of resources playing a different role in before, during, and after. And so it's some of those cases about how resources are fueling, perpetuating the conflict, or at times making them more violent because it can be fungible and lootable and turned into money to make weapons. And so it's a broader category, the one here I think that we're using. So John Pielemeyer, then we'll come around. Got lots of folks.
This question is for Mr. Steiner and also for Mr. Reef-Snyder, perhaps. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer with USAID, but I do a lot of independent consulting and evaluation of environmental programs, including in the Congo a couple of years ago. I'm wondering whether we're organizationally structured to deal with complex post-conflict issues. The U.S. government has found, even within USAID, because of the way money flows, it's very difficult to deal with complex issues when the money stream is either environment money or it's health money, and it makes it very difficult to deal with the community level issues that are really primary when you're dealing with folks that are being ravaged, their communities are being ravaged, and they're trying to put their communities back together. You don't really need one organization, one part of your program doing environmental work, and another one doing health issues, another one trying to help with agriculture production. It's very inefficient. And if it's difficult for the U.S. government, I'm wondering how much more difficult it is for UN agencies to work together to find ways to cooperate and break down organizational barriers to deal with post-conflict situations. I'm wondering whether you've been looking at that issue.
Thank you. I think in your question lies part of the answer. You have to reduce complexity. I think this is what Dan was also referring to, because if you try to deal with the full range of issues, you're unlikely, particularly given very often post-conflict situations are not the easiest ones to work in. So you probably have to do what every good business school teaches you as well, try and reduce complexity in order to become capable of acting. And I think to some extent in the analytical stage, in the UN system, we are not facing that many difficulties, and we have established a very functional structure. I mean, the world often doesn't realize that within 24 hours the UN system mobilizes, whether it's a tsunami, whether it's a chemical spill, whether it is a disaster, it's an earthquake. We have a machinery that in some ways is quite impressive, partly because we have learned some very bitter lessons over the last 2 or 3 decades. So if you look at the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the ability of UNICEF World Food Programme to, in a sense, coordinate action, I think that initial emergency response, also in a conflict situation, I mean, the world often is very cynical about the capacity of the UN to react, but just the recent conflict again in DRC, I mean, at the end of the day, the ability of the different arms of the United Nations to deliver emergency food, Obasanjo's negotiation process, the political dimension to it, I have to say I find quite impressive, having watched it over a number of years now from a closer vantage point. Where it gets more complicated, and you saw some of the examples that we have here, is how do you then deal with the long-term peace building and stabilization measures, and how do you deal with the fact that you could be investing in health infrastructure, you could be investing in afforestation, you could be dealing with schools rebuilding programs. And I think here we are still struggling in the way that not only the multilateral system, the bilateral system, essentially the entire foreign aid support effort interfaces with a largely often dysfunctional domestic coordination capacity. And I think here there is no simple answer except to perhaps pick a few transformative actions on the back of which you can build perhaps a more resilient set of interventions that deal with complexity. But that would be my answer in terms of where I see the greatest Achilles heel, if you want. But if you take an intervention like Afghanistan, maybe Andrew can say a couple of words about it. It's, in a sense, you could almost say, it's hopeless. I mean, there are parts of the country you can't work in. There is a very weak institutional structure, etc., etc. And yet, our Afghanistan team won an award last year in UNIT because it is considered one of the most successful programs we have undertaken in a post-conflict situation. Iraqi marshlands. Again, we picked an issue in Iraq which is fundamental from a cultural, a human rights point of view, a hydrological management point of view, and access to water. And in this madness of Iraq, have actually been able to restore a significant part of the Iraqi marshlands by redirecting, reopening water channels, dealing with undoing the legacy of Saddam Hussein's water politics. So it's a contradictory set of lessons and realities that seem to emerge from a complexity in these post-conflict situations.
I would only maybe make one comment, too, that what we found in DRC Congo is that, of course, all things can happen in the absence of conflict, that the presence of conflict prohibits almost anything from happening. And so security issues are first and foremost critical to development. But I think reports such as this and the work that we're all doing in the government now lead people to increase recognition of the importance of security to all of the efforts in whatever area of sustainable development we're talking about.
Okay, sure. I have two things. The ray of hope on the issue of UN unity and how to deal with this complex situation. There is a solution evolving. It's called One UN, and the idea is to simply coordinate UN operations in particular countries under a common plan and a single leadership, which is essentially a gentleman called the resident, or lady called the resident coordinator. And gradually we're shifting towards more strength and more coherence, stronger office, central office, and all the various agencies coming under that umbrella for mutual benefit in terms of improved fundraising, more coherent plans, shared resources, etc. So it is happening. It's happening faster in some countries because we have pilot projects, but it is starting to happen, and very good news on that. On particular cases like Afghanistan, it's a very interesting one for me in that it shows all the types of interventions you can have during a conflict scenario. The UN is present in some cases, but not in all. And at the furthest line, you've got this big experiment going on, which essentially is military campaigns running side by side, sort of hearts and minds, run by military actors. Now, there's a lot of issues with that about humanitarian space and independence, but people are recognising that even in the middle of a hot conflict, you need to look at the livelihoods of the people around you to actually turn them from part of the problem to being part of the solution. So again, there's a lot of innovation happening and good prospects. On the US side, for coordination, is looking good here as well, because the last 2 days and tomorrow I'm talking to 7 elements, 7 arms of the US government, and they're all asking the same questions and the same issues: climate change, security, whether it's the military command, State Department, the White House Security Council, the Congress, the Senate staffers, USAID, and State Department. They're all asking the same questions. And they're all in the same room today at lunch. So I am very optimistic, actually. I was really impressed. So I look forward to seeing a coherent USA strategy coming up very shortly.
We didn't orchestrate that either.
We go to Leslie next. We've got a lot of hands here.
Hi, my name's Leslie Fields, and I'm the Environmental Justice Director for the Sierra Club. I'm also on the board of an organization called Horn Relief, which is an environment and development organization regarding the issues around the Horn of Africa and Somalia. And my question is mainly for Mr. Riefsnyder, is because Somalia has the longest coastline on the continent, as you know, there's unfettered dumping, there's a charcoal market that's destroying the acacias out of the Arab Peninsula, there is destruction of the fisheries and wholesale destruction of the environment. I'm wondering if there's any new thinking on some kind of environmental reconciliation with Somalia and the new government by the State Department.
You know, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that because it's not an area in which I work, and it's a real problem. I mean, I know that part of the recognition, the problems of piracy recently off the coast of Somalia have been, excuse me, people have begun to understand that part of the problem with piracy is the fact that you also have wholesale illegal fishing taking place, which has destroyed the livelihood for many of the fishermen in Somalia, so that some have been reduced to other forms of activity. I don't know the answer to the problem. I know it is a huge one.
Okay, all the way to the back, and then we'll come down here. Sorry, folks, we'll get you.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm John McCormick with the Energy Policy Center, and my comment and question is directed to Dr. Steiner. You identify yourself as a solution provider and a problem solver. I'd like to take you directly to the issue of glaciers in the Himalayas, and something you know so well. As the glaciers continue to demise, 2 billion people are threatened by availability of water in the long term. So it's a question of a conflict that may be occurring over time, but certainly is growing tension. Now, the United Nations put together the CITES, and that protects snow leopards and black rhinos. But there's a common element of all these countries that rely upon the Himalayan glaciers, and that is ice. And that should be a common property as well. And I'm wondering if it isn't time that perhaps the United Nations consider the Himalayan glaciers as also an endangered species of another sort, and begin to protect the glaciers, because we can avoid conflicts that are beyond perhaps our imagination. I'm wondering if the United Nations might entertain such an idea.
Do you want to take a few, because you have a lot of hands?
Okay, sure.
I mean,
Yeah,
I've taken note of it and I'll answer.
Good point.
But,
We'll
yeah.
get that down. So why don't we come down here, Kaylee, and then, Will, if you could go to the back, we'll have Kaylee do the front.
Thank you. My name is Rita Cleese. I'm a retired environmental specialist from the World Bank, and I'm now at the University of Colorado. Several years ago, I think it was in 2000 when I was at the bank, I developed with GEF funding a joint project with Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was one of your countries, and Croatia on a transboundary river basin management project. It easily could have been 2 separate projects in 2 separate countries. I think the countries would have preferred that. But without ever articulating it, certainly in my mind, and I was the environmental specialist for the bank for both countries, peace building this was several years after the war, was on my mind. It was a GEF project, and as you were talking today, I thought, maybe it'd be cool if there was a GEF program. Instead of International Waterways, we could have called that peace building. But I realized had we used the word peace building, nobody would have come to the table. In the process of designing that project, when I wasn't present at a meeting on purpose and just the country water authorities were there, I heard it was reported back to me that they noted that was the first time that they had sat at the table with one another since the war. So my question is, how do you package this? Once again, if we called it a peace building anything, we wouldn't have gotten very far. We wouldn't have had the right people in terms of natural resource management at the table. So we've kind of slid it in there, but I would have liked to have seen it acknowledged for what it was.
Great, terrific. We'll go in the back, but I think it's a very good question. How do you do something without being explicit in the terms of the label? So, Will, if you go to the gentleman all the way in the back.
Thank you. I'm Nick Oakley from Search for Common Ground. We work in over 19 countries around the world on peace building and conflict resolution. I have two questions. Firstly, commend the efforts you're making at getting a unified approach within the UN, but I wonder what dialogue you're having with the World Bank. I was at an event there recently on the social consequences of climate change, where the evidence of the link between conflict and environment was denied, an issue that's been raised earlier. So I'm just sort of wondering what efforts you're having with convincing the World Bank that this is something to invest in and support. Secondly, I'm just wondering what advice you might have in terms of those organisations, NGOs that work in the area of conflict and peace building, what opportunities there might be given the problems that have been described in terms of the way in which these issues are packaged up in terms of silo stream thinking, getting involved on the ground to support the work I think that you mentioned in your report here around contributing to dialogue, confidence building and cooperation.
Okay, terrific. Why don't we take one more? There's a hand right down in front of you, Will, and then we'll give our panelists a chance and then try to get some more.
Hi, my name's Samantha Holkauer. I'm with the EPA. I was wondering if any of you saw any potential benefits that could come out of the post-Kyoto discussions in Copenhagen this year, the opportunity to direct resources for technology transfer or reforestation efforts to areas where it's needed now, such as Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, particularly on the adaptation side. Who would like to dive into that rich set of questions first?
Shall I? Okay, let me take very briefly. Very interesting idea on ice. I remember once, I can't remember her name, but it was an indigenous peoples representative from the Inuit, I think, who said, we have a right to be cold and cool. This was in Montreal at the climate change COP, and it raised the question, how are basic human rights related to climate change? And, one of the remarkable things that's happened in the UN in the last year is that climate change is now an explicit issue within the Human Rights Commission, which would have been unthinkable just a couple of years ago. So we are seeing, in a sense, dots being connected and issues brought together. I can't really answer your question right now because I haven't thought of it in those terms. I mean, in a sense, you could argue that water has always been an issue that riparian laws and let's say resource sharing agreements have dealt with. So, can we declare ice in a sense an asset? I'll think about it, but I can't really answer it right now. But it's an interesting thought, and certainly the spectrum of what is happening in the Himalayas is horrendous. The spectrum of what's happening in the Andes is horrendous in terms of the sheer implications for, as you said, tens if not hundreds of millions of people. Entire settlement patterns, entire agricultural production systems, entire energy generating systems relying on hydropower may well be completely redundant within 2 to 3 to 4 decades, affecting a vast number of people. How we're going to adapt to that, how we're going to cope with this, is still the most unanswered question of our time. And I think we have no sense at the moment of the unfolding scale of the drama that initially some communities will face, whether it's sea level rise in Bangladesh or whether it is the droughts or the extremes in weather patterns in the Caribbean. And it still stuns me that there are people having large congresses right now that are essentially trumpeting a notion as if climate change was still a totally contested science. I mean, it is extraordinary. It is almost irresponsible, which is not to deny that there is always a necessity to question accepted truth, but to still have a scientific fundamentalism at the moment not allowing us to think through what we may have to cope with in just 2 to 3 decades is something that is very disturbing to me. And the examples you gave, I think, very much fall within that. Rita's mentioning of what do we call it? I mean, I would, in a sense, say one of the ironies is that peace building and peace making and peacekeeping is actually something that perhaps ironically, there are a lot of resources for. So perhaps we should sometimes put some of these issues that we call, some very technical things of transboundary waterways and so on, which sometimes may be politically a little bit sensitive, but from a financing point of view, I can assure you in the United Nations, peacekeeping operations are now the largest, in a sense, task that we fulfill. It's a sad fact of life. But perhaps if you look at this kind of framing of the issue, what you begin to do is you don't pretend that there is an environmental or a health project or something. You start beginning to connect issues. And I think the sooner we start talking about the linkage between environment, natural resources and conflict, and therefore peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, the more likely we are to get not only the resources, but in fact perhaps the level of political integration that we need across government, which is, as much the hydrological managers, so to speak, as we need perhaps the environment, the foreign office, and even the armed forces, for that matter, in terms of cross-border security and conflict reduction potential. But it may require a new term, perhaps the hybrid that will come out of this. But I think that what is coming out of this is that we need perhaps hybrid concepts that allow us not to revert back into these old sectoral approaches, which I think cannot answer to the complexity that we had heard about earlier. Nick, I'm a bit surprised that the World Bank would say something. Maybe there is somebody there, but I think the World Bank certainly is not in denial about global warming, climate change, the social impacts of it. I mean, with all the elements of the bank that I work with, so it might be interesting afterwards to find out where exactly that happened. The fact that the bank itself is struggling in terms of its, operational mandate and its vehicles of lending for development, that it is struggling to get to the transformative ambition that it itself has articulated on climate change, particularly related to energy infrastructure. I think that is something we should focus on. But that is not out of denial. I think it is more out of the struggle of how does a development bank become a transformative lender or indeed a financial transactor in the global climate change negotiations. And finally, for Copenhagen, and one example I would give you is reducing emissions from deforestation. I think this could be a dramatic way in which action on climate change and the response to global warming could become the precursor for a remarkably important concept, which is that we have an international payment for ecosystem services concept, or co-investing in the capacity of certain key resources on the planet to sustain us all. So I think RED is one very concrete one, adaptation is, and adaptation financing is, and thirdly, I think the issue of a technology and financing partnership is now at a point where either Copenhagen delivers something that is significantly and a quantum leap from Kyoto, or the world will find itself very much at odds with one another on how to deal with climate change.
Well, I'd like to try to address three of those points that were raised. I think first one I just hit was on are there opportunities for NGOs to get involved in this kind of work? I would say that we have benefited a lot in our work from the NGOs who are already on the ground and working in these areas. They're way ahead in many cases of governments, I would say. Many different groups are in the Congo, for example, now. I know that they've done pioneering work on alternatives to charcoal, for example, ways to make briquettes from detritus and other sorts of things, and on more efficient cook stoves. There's a lot of very excellent work that they've done also with communities and bringing people in to discussions of how to address some of these issues. So yes, I think we need to work with NGOs a lot in this area. I think they have a lot that they offer, and we can learn a lot as we begin to move into these areas from them. I would agree with Akam completely. I think RED, R-E-D-D, is the big issue in Copenhagen that's going to open up potentially a lot of possibilities. I think the most intriguing question to me, though, was how do you package this stuff? I think that was a question from over here. And I would say, I mean, to me, I could sort of come back with something. I would say tie it to a felt political need. And the reason I say that is because every time, well, very often when we have a UNEP governing council, we've had some conflict somewhere in the world that ends up coming out of nowhere onto the plate of everybody at the UNEP governing council meeting. And so the question is, well, what do we do about this conflict? Well, what we normally do is we ask Occam Steiner to dispatch a group to do a post-conflict assessment in this area. Mm-hmm. And this is, kind of how we respond to it. And so there's a great willingness on the part of everyone to do a post-conflict assessment, because that's seen as being the middle ground, between some of the extreme things people propose to do and other possibilities. And so there's always, to my mind, a lot of support for these post-conflict assessments, particularly in the context of a big deal meeting with a lot of ministers there and a lot of concern about the outcome of the session. The interesting part of this, though, is that I noticed that Andrew's slides tonight mentioned a $20 million fund that would be a kind of an amount that would be available so that UNEP could deploy people in these situations. I asked Occam, do you have such a fund? And he sort of said, well, of course not. I mean, I guess I let him speak, but this is money that he has to draw from other areas, other things when these things happen. There's no pre-existing fund that allows UNEP or others to deploy quickly in those situations. So the money could be had, but as I say, I think tying it to a felt political need is the way to do it. And if there's a way to package that into a fund that responds to a series of felt political needs, even better. It would still take some work, but that's how I would try to do it.
I'll just add some detail on one point, which is, for example, the Himalayas and the problem there. When you get such geopolitical monsters, such as what happens to the Indian subcontinent with climate change and Himalayas, one of these solutions is not to just do an analysis which says, okay, there's going to be a political problem, is unpack it into its components. And one of those we've been looking at an emerging partnership with IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration, and that is, what's the climate change-induced migration? Because it won't happen as conflict. You'll have a social change, and that will create fertile ground for potential conflict. So what are the numbers? And if we look at them, actually we find there are no good numbers. People have not done the work. So that's a role for us in cooperation with other parts of the UN to actually say, on best available science, best scenarios, and the best social data we have, this is the projection. We have some rough figures now, but that is nowhere near good enough to actually develop policy and direct investment. So that's a typical area where we hope to invest sort of intellectual capital.
Terrific. Well, I know we have a number of other questions. I'm afraid, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the time. I'll urge you to pose them as we break up, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention and thank some of the folks who really did a lot of the hard work behind this. David Jensen, Andrew's colleague Richard Matthew at UC Irvine, Ollie Brown at IISD, the folks who really took the initial cracks and then the second draft and the third draft and the fourth and tried to integrate all those reviews that Andrew pointed out were done. They weren't able to be with us, but really deserve our commendation for putting that together. But Akim, Dan, and Andrew, thank you all very much. A very rich presentation of this report, of these issues more broadly, and then the kind of vision for these two institutions of how we wrap our arms around these. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. And thank the audience for some excellent questions and staying with us through the evening in a kind of outside the normal Wilson Center bound times for meetings. We appreciate you coming this evening to accommodate schedules. And join me in thanking our panelists for today's discussion, please.